Some people believe money changes people. They're wrong. Money only reveals who was already looking away. The first thing people noticed about me was never my name. It was my uniform, faded grey, stiff from too many wash cycles. The hem had been stitched so many times that the thread no longer matched the fabric. Every morning before sunrise, I ironed it as carefully as if it were silk, hoping neatness could hide poverty. It never did. By 6:30, I was already pushing a supply cart through the endless marble hallways of Ashcroft Manor, a mansion so enormous that the echo of my footsteps disappeared before I reached the next corridor. Crystal chandeliers floated above polished floors that reflected every light like a quiet lake, while paintings older than my entire hometown stared down from walls trimmed with gold. I spent my days dusting treasures I could never afford to imagine owning. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the glass display cases. 24 years old, blonde hair pulled into the tightest bun I could manage, fair skin that looked even paler beneath fluorescent lights, blue eyes permanently tired from working 2 jobs and sleeping barely 5 hours each night. My name was Emily Carter, but inside that mansion I was usually called Maid, Girl, or simply whistled toward another chore. I answered anyway. Rent didn't care about pride. Neither did overdue medical bills for my grandmother. Every paycheck already belonged to someone else before it ever reached my hands. That Friday was different from the moment I stepped through the servants' entrance. Luxury SUVs lined the circular driveway, one after another, as valets rushed like performers rehearsing the same perfect routine. Tonight's charity gala would bring together politicians, CEOs, celebrities, and families whose last names filled newspaper headlines. Mrs. Whitmore, the estate manager, marched through the kitchen with a clipboard pressed against her chest. Perfect smiles. No mistakes. These guests notice everything, she warned. I almost laughed. They noticed everything, except the people carrying the trays. I spent the afternoon arranging fresh white roses taller than I was, polishing silver until my fingers ached, and replacing candles before anyone could complain they had burned unevenly. Around 5 o'clock, I reached for a serving tray when the thin fabric near my sleeve caught on a decorative brass handle. Rip. The sound was quiet, but to me it felt louder than thunder. I froze. Another tear stretched along my already worn uniform, exposing the patch I'd sewn only 3 nights earlier. I quickly pulled my arm behind my back, praying no one had seen it. Honestly, Emily, another housekeeper whispered gently, you should throw that thing away. I smiled because smiling cost less than explaining I couldn't afford another uniform. Outside, the sunset painted the estate in warm gold, while inside, every light glowed brighter with each arriving guest. Music drifted through the ballroom as servers formed perfect lines beside polished doors. I balanced a silver tray loaded with sparkling water glasses and reminded myself to breathe slowly. One mistake could cost me this job. One broken glass could mean another overdue bill. As the grand doors opened, elegant dresses swept across marble floors like moving paintings. Expensive watches flashed beneath crystal lights, and laughter filled every corner of the room. I lowered my eyes, just another invisible employee blending into the background. Then the atmosphere changed without anyone announcing it. Conversations softened, smiles stiffened, even the security staff straightened almost instinctively. I looked toward the entrance before I could stop myself, wondering who could silence an entire ballroom simply by walking through the door. The man who entered did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Silence welcomed him before anyone else could. I had never seen Adrian Moretti before that night, but I knew immediately that he was the reason every conversation had slowed to a whisper. He looked younger than I expected, maybe 31, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that somehow appeared effortless instead of expensive. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his fair skin almost glowing beneath the crystal chandeliers, and his calm blue eyes moved across the ballroom with quiet precision, noticing details everyone else ignored. Guests smiled at him with practiced confidence, but none of them looked completely relaxed. Even the people worth millions seemed eager for his approval. I lowered my head and focused on balancing my silver tray. Invisible. That was always the safest place to be. Table 6, another server whispered, as she brushed past me. I nodded and crossed the ballroom, weaving carefully between conversations about investments, political campaigns, and vacation homes somewhere I would probably never visit. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with fresh roses and polished wood filled the air. A violin quartet played softly near the grand staircase, making the entire evening feel like something from a movie instead of real life. My worn sleeve brushed against my wrist again, reminding me of the small tear I had tried so hard to hide. I shifted the tray to cover it. Maybe if I finished the night quietly, nobody would notice. Then I heard laughter. Not joyful laughter, the sharp kind that always made someone else the joke. "Look at her sleeve," a woman said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I kept walking. Maybe she meant someone else. "No, the little maid," another voice answered. "Does this place not pay enough for a proper uniform?" Heat rushed into my face. I forced myself to keep smiling, the same polite smile I had practiced in mirrors for years. Mrs. Whitmore had one rule above all others: never argue with a guest. I stopped beside their table and gently placed fresh glasses of sparkling water in front of each person. My hands stayed steady, even though my heartbeat did not. "Thank you," one gentleman said kindly, but the elegant woman beside him reached toward my sleeve before I could step away. Her fingers pinched the frayed fabric with visible disgust. "This is practically falling apart," she laughed. I instinctively stepped back, embarrassed more than frightened. The movement caused the loose stitching near my elbow to pull a little farther apart. A few nearby guests turned to look. I wished the marble floor would simply open beneath me. "Perhaps housekeeping should begin with their own appearance," the woman continued, lifting her champagne glass while several people chuckled politely. I quietly apologized, although I had done nothing wrong, and turned to leave before my eyes betrayed the tears I refused to shed. That was when I felt it. Not a hand, not a command, just a presence. I looked across the ballroom and found Adrian Moretti watching me. He was not smiling. He was not angry either. His expression was unreadable, almost thoughtful, as though the torn sleeve mattered far more than the diamonds glittering around him. Our eyes met for only a second before I looked away, convinced I had somehow made another mistake. Yet when I continued toward the service entrance, I could still feel his attention following every careful step I took, and for reasons I could not explain, it frightened me far less than being laughed at by the room behind me. The service door had almost closed behind me when Mrs. Whitmore's voice stopped me. "Emily, return to the ballroom immediately. The dessert service begins in 3 minutes." I swallowed the lump in my throat, smoothed the front of my worn uniform, and nodded without arguing. There was no time to recover my pride. There was only work. I picked up another silver tray and stepped back beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, hoping the attention had already drifted toward wealthier distractions. It had not. The same elegant woman smiled, as though the evening existed for her amusement alone. She lifted her champagne glass and waved me over with 2 perfectly manicured fingers. "You," she said, "come here." Every instinct told me to stay where I was, but servants did not ignore guests. I approached quietly. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes travelled slowly over my uniform before stopping at the torn sleeve. "It looks even worse up close." Several people nearby chuckled politely. Someone muttered that the estate should hire better staff. Another guest commented that appearances mattered at charity events. I kept my eyes lowered. My grandmother used to tell me that dignity was sometimes measured by the words you refused to answer. I repeated those words silently, while tightening my grip on the tray. Then the woman reached forward again. This time her diamond bracelet caught the loose fabric hanging from my sleeve. The old stitching gave way, with a soft ripping sound that echoed much louder inside my own mind. The tear spread from my elbow almost to my shoulder. My breathing stopped. The room grew strangely quiet as several guests stared at the exposed patchwork repairs beneath the fabric. I instinctively crossed my arm over my chest, trying to hide the damage, but embarrassment arrived faster than my hands. "Goodness," the woman laughed. "Someone should help this poor girl before she falls apart with her uniform." More laughter followed. It was not cruel enough to shock anyone. It was simply comfortable enough that nobody felt responsible for stopping it. I whispered another apology, although I still did not know what I had done wrong. I turned toward the service hallway, desperate to disappear before the tears filling my eyes escaped. Stay. The single word was calm, low, and impossible to ignore. I froze. Adrian Moretti had finally spoken. Every conversation around us stopped. Even the musicians lowered their instruments without realizing it. I slowly faced him. He walked toward me with unhurried confidence, his polished shoes making almost no sound against the marble floor. He did not look at the guests. He did not acknowledge the woman who had laughed. His attention remained entirely on the damaged sleeve I was still trying to hide. "Look at me," he said gently. I hesitated before raising my eyes. There was no mockery waiting there. Only quiet disappointment, directed somewhere beyond me. His gaze moved across the worn fabric, the faded stitching, the careful repairs that had been made by hands, trying to stretch every dollar. Without asking another question, he lightly lifted the loose edge of the torn cloth between his fingers. The old material separated with almost no effort, revealing how fragile it had become after years of use. He released it and looked toward the estate manager. "No one wearing humiliation works for me," he said with absolute calm. "Call the best designer in the city. Open every boutique if necessary. Tonight, Miss Emily Carter walks back into this ballroom, dressed with the dignity everyone else forgot she already deserved." For a moment, I could not breathe. I looked from Adrian Moretti to Mrs. Whitmore, expecting someone to smile and admit it had all been a joke. Nobody did. The ballroom remained perfectly still, as though every person inside had forgotten the next step in a carefully rehearsed performance. Mrs. Whitmore recovered first. "Right away, Mr. Moretti," she answered, her voice suddenly softer than I had ever heard it. Two assistants hurried toward the service entrance with their phones already in their hands, speaking rapidly about boutiques, designers, jewelers, and stylists. I stared at them in disbelief. "No," I said before I could stop myself. The single word echoed louder than I intended. Every eye turned back toward me. My heart pounded so hard I thought everyone could hear it. "I am sorry," I continued, forcing myself to stay respectful. "There is no reason for any of this. I only need another uniform. I can sew this one after my shift." Adrian studied me for several quiet seconds. His expression remained calm, impossible to read. "Is that what you believe you deserve?" he asked. I hesitated. "It is what I need." That was not my question. I lowered my eyes again. Nobody had ever asked me what I deserved. Bills demanded payment. Employers demanded perfection. Life demanded endurance. Deserving had never entered the conversation. "Emily," Mrs. Whitmore whispered urgently beside me, "please cooperate." I turned toward her. "I cannot accept something that expensive. I could never repay it." A faint smile touched Adrian's face for the first time that evening. It was not amused. It was almost sad. "Kindness is not a loan," he said quietly. "Neither is dignity." Those words settled somewhere deep inside me, but years of surviving with almost nothing refused to let me believe them. "People will think I asked for this," I answered. "They will think I wanted attention." Around us, the guests watched silently. The woman who had laughed earlier no longer looked entertained. She avoided my eyes completely. Adrian glanced across the ballroom before looking back at me. "They have already decided who you are without asking your name," he said. "Tonight they can learn they were wrong." Before I could answer, a team of professionals entered through the grand doors, carrying garment bags, makeup cases, shoe boxes, and carefully packed jewelry displays. They moved with astonishing speed, yet none of them treated me like a servant. One woman with silver hair approached and smiled warmly. "Miss Carter, I am Sophia. We are going to take very good care of you." I instinctively stepped backward. "Please, I really do not belong here." Sophia gently shook her head. "We are not here because of where you belong. We are here because someone finally noticed how everyone else forgot to see you." Those words nearly broke the wall I had spent years building around my emotions. Two attendants led me toward a private guest suite overlooking the gardens. As I reached the doorway, I turned once more toward the ballroom. Adrian had not moved. He simply gave one small nod, as though reminding me that the choice to walk through that door was still mine. I looked down at my torn sleeve one last time. Every patch represented another month I had survived. Every stitch carried a memory of choosing responsibility over comfort. Slowly, I released my grip on the damaged fabric and stepped inside the suite. still convinced that no beautiful dress in the world could change the frightened maid who looked back at me from every mirror. The guest suite was larger than the apartment where my grandmother and I had lived for the past 8 years. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked perfectly trimmed gardens glowing beneath soft evening lights. Fresh white orchids rested on polished tables, and the quiet scent of vanilla filled the room. I stood just inside the doorway, afraid that even my shoes might leave marks on the expensive carpet. Sophia smiled kindly as the rest of her team arranged garment bags along one wall. "You may relax," she said. "Tonight is about making you comfortable." I almost laughed. Comfortable was not a feeling I recognized anymore. Comfortable meant bills already paid, groceries already bought, medicine already waiting on the kitchen counter. Comfortable had never looked like this. A young assistant carefully offered me a glass of water. Another asked whether I preferred my hair up or down. Someone else measured my shoulders with practiced precision while speaking so gently that it felt more like conversation than work. Nobody rushed me. Nobody barked orders. Nobody reminded me that I was only the maid. I kept waiting for someone to discover they had made a terrible mistake. Instead, they treated me as though I had been expected all along. One elegant gown after another appeared from protective garment bags. Midnight blue, soft emerald, ivory satin, deep burgundy velvet. I shook my head every time. "They are all beautiful," I whispered, "but they belong to someone else." Sophia folded her hands. "Tonight they belong to the woman wearing them." I looked at my reflection in the oversized mirror. My faded uniform suddenly seemed even older beneath the bright lights. Every patch, every careful repair, reminded me how hard I had fought simply to keep going. "I do not want people looking at me," I admitted quietly. "They already were," Sophia answered. "The difference is that now they might finally see you." Her words lingered in the room long after she stopped speaking. She selected a graceful champagne-colored evening gown, with clean lines and understated elegance, rather than glitter or excess. "This one," she said softly, "it does not hide who you are. It lets you breathe." I disappeared behind a folding screen to change. As I slipped out of my worn uniform, I paused before folding it carefully, instead of tossing it aside. I ran my fingers across the patched sleeve one final time. That uniform had carried me through thousands of exhausting hours. It deserved gratitude, not embarrassment. I placed it gently on a nearby chair before stepping into the new dress. The fabric felt impossibly light, almost weightless against my skin. When I stepped back into the room, everyone became unusually quiet. Nobody applauded. Nobody gasped dramatically. They simply smiled. Real smiles. Sophia adjusted one shoulder with delicate care before stepping away. "Now," she whispered. "Look." I turned toward the mirror slowly, almost afraid of what I would find. The woman staring back at me still had fair skin, blue eyes, and the same nervous expression I had carried into the mansion that morning. My face had not changed. My heart had not changed. Yet somehow the exhaustion no longer introduced me before I could speak. My hair fell naturally across my shoulders. The gown fit as though it had always belonged to me. Simple pearl earrings reflected the warm lights without demanding attention. I blinked once, twice. Tears gathered before I could stop them. "I still feel like Emily," I whispered. Sophia smiled. That was always the goal. Downstairs, the ballroom continued celebrating beneath crystal chandeliers, completely unaware that the frightened maid they had overlooked only an hour earlier was taking one slow breath after another, gathering the courage to walk back into the same room, with her head held just a little higher. The moment I stepped back into the ballroom, every conversation dissolved into silence again. It was different this time. Earlier they had looked at my torn sleeve, now they looked at my face. Not because I had become someone new, but because they were trying to understand how someone they had ignored only an hour before could suddenly seem impossible to overlook. My heels moved carefully across the polished marble floor. I still walked the way a maid walked, quietly, trying not to interrupt anyone else's evening. The gown had changed my appearance, but it had not erased years of learning to stay invisible. I caught sight of a silver tray resting on a nearby serving station, and instinctively reached for it. "Miss Carter." A server gently stopped me with an awkward smile. "You are not working tonight." I blinked in confusion. "I still have 3 hours left on my shift." He glanced across the room before lowering his voice. "I do not think Mr. Moretti would agree." I slowly withdrew my hand from the tray. The words felt unreal. Work had always been the one thing nobody could take away from me. Standing still felt far more uncomfortable than carrying heavy trays ever had. Adrian stood near the grand fireplace, speaking with several business leaders. They listened carefully whenever he spoke, but his attention drifted toward me almost immediately. He excused himself with a polite nod and crossed the ballroom without hurrying. The closer he came, the more nervous I became. "Does it feel any different?" he asked. I looked down at the elegant fabric before meeting his eyes again. "The dress is beautiful." "That was not my question." I smiled faintly. "You ask difficult questions." "Only honest ones." I took a slow breath. "No, I still feel like the same woman who cleaned these floors this morning." A quiet expression of relief crossed his face. "Good." That answer surprised me. "You are not disappointed." He shook his head once. "If a dress had changed who you are, it would have been the wrong dress." I studied him carefully, searching for hidden intentions. Wealthy men usually expected gratitude that sounded like surrender. Adrian simply waited. "You changed my clothes," I finally said. "Not my life." The words escaped before I could soften them. Several nearby guests turned toward us, clearly expecting tension. Instead, Adrian nodded almost thoughtfully. "You are right," he answered. "Clothes cannot repair loneliness. They cannot erase years of sacrifice. They cannot repay everything life demanded from you." His honesty unsettled me more than anger ever could. "Then why did you do this?" I asked quietly. He looked across the ballroom toward the table where the earlier laughter had begun. "Because nobody should be treated as though their worth depends on worn fabric." His voice remained calm. "They laughed at your uniform because it was easier than questioning themselves." I followed his gaze. The elegant woman who had mocked me earlier quickly looked away the moment our eyes almost met. For the first time that evening, I did not feel embarrassed. I simply felt tired. "I never wanted revenge," I whispered. "Neither did I." Adrian's answer came immediately. "I wanted them to remember that respect should never depend on appearance." The violin quartet began another gentle melody as guests slowly returned to their conversations. Yet something had changed. People who had ignored me earlier now greeted me with polite smiles. Some even introduced themselves. I thanked them respectfully, but deep inside, I understood something important. Their kindness arrived only after expensive fabric introduced me first. As I looked back at Adrian, I realized he seemed to understand that painful truth just as clearly as I did. And for the first time all evening, I wondered whether the loneliest person inside that magnificent ballroom had never been the maid at all. The evening should have returned to normal, but something invisible had shifted beneath the polished surface of the gala. I could feel it the same way people sensed a storm before the first drop of rain. Conversations sounded polished, yet nervous glances traveled across the ballroom more often than before. I tried to ignore the feeling. It was not my place to question anything happening inside a world that had never belonged to me. I excused myself from another polite conversation and slipped onto the quiet terrace for a moment of fresh air. The cool breeze carried the scent of roses from the gardens below, calming the tightness in my chest. I rested my hands lightly against the stone railing and reminded myself that by tomorrow morning I would probably be wearing my old jeans, making coffee for my grandmother, and wondering if any of this had actually happened. Behind me, the ballroom doors remained slightly open. Music drifted outside together, with fragments of conversations. Most of them blended together, until two unfamiliar voices caught my attention. "He always reviews the donation contracts before midnight," one man whispered. "The folder will be on the library desk after his speech." Another voice answered quietly. "Once he signs the wrong document, everything transfers automatically. He will never notice until it is too late." My heartbeat quickened. I frowned, wondering if I had misunderstood. I should have walked away immediately. Instead, I remained perfectly still, hidden behind a tall marble column wrapped with climbing ivy. "Keep the replacement folder ready," the first man continued. Nobody questions paperwork during a celebration. Footsteps approached. I quickly stepped farther into the shadows, just before two well-dressed men exited onto the opposite side of the terrace. They smiled as though discussing harmless business, before walking calmly toward the gardens. The ballroom music covered the sound of their voices until they disappeared completely. I stood frozen for several seconds. Maybe it was nothing. Wealthy people discussed contracts every day. Maybe I had misunderstood one sentence and built an entire disaster around it. But another memory surfaced. During my second month working at Ashcroft Manor, Mrs. Whitmore had once told every employee that Mr. Moretti personally reviewed every charitable donation because he refused to let dishonest people exploit families in need. Suddenly those whispered words no longer sounded ordinary. They sounded deliberate. I hurried back inside, searching for Adrian through the sea of elegant guests. He stood near the stage, listening respectfully as the foundation chairman introduced the evening's largest scholarship initiative. People applauded warmly. Cameras flashed. Everything looked perfectly normal. Yet my stomach refused to settle. I crossed the ballroom as quickly as I could without running. One of Adrian's security men stepped politely into my path. "Miss Carter, may I help you?" he asked. I glanced toward Adrian. "I need to speak with Mr. Moretti." "It cannot wait." The guard studied my face for a brief moment, perhaps noticing that I was not frightened for myself. He leaned toward Adrian and quietly said something. Adrian immediately excused himself from the group and walked over. "Emily," he said calmly. "What happened?" I hesitated. What if I embarrassed myself? What if I had misunderstood everything? Then I remembered the certainty in those whispered voices. "I might be completely wrong," I admitted softly, "but I think someone is planning to deceive you tonight, using documents connected to the charity." Adrian did not interrupt. He simply watched my face with complete attention. When I finished, he remained silent for one long moment before speaking to his security chief. "Seal the library, quietly. Nobody leaves until every donation file is verified." There was no panic in his voice, only calm confidence. As his team disappeared into the crowd without attracting attention, Adrian looked back at me. "Thank you," he said. "Most people hear words. You listened for truth." The celebration continued as though nothing unusual had happened, yet I could sense invisible currents moving beneath every smile. Waiters served dessert with perfect timing. Crystal glasses reflected golden light. A string quartet filled the ballroom with gentle music, masking the quiet efficiency of Adrian's security team as they disappeared through different hallways without alarming a single guest. Nobody noticed except me. I stood near one of the tall windows, trying to steady my breathing, wondering whether I had just imagined everything. 10 minutes felt like an hour. Then Adrian returned. His expression remained calm, but there was something softer in his eyes than before. He stopped beside me without speaking immediately. "You were right," he said at last. "The documents had been replaced." I stared at him in disbelief. "They really did it." He gave a small nod. "The signatures would have redirected millions of dollars away from scholarship programs and into private accounts hidden behind legal language most people would never question." I looked toward the ballroom, where guests continued laughing beneath glittering chandeliers, completely unaware that an entire charitable foundation had nearly been exploited in the middle of its own celebration. "I only overheard a conversation," I whispered. "You listened when everyone else assumed nothing important could come from voices they did not recognize." His answer settled quietly between us. For years I had believed that people stopped seeing me because I wore a maid's uniform. Tonight, I realized something even sadder. They had stopped listening long before they stopped looking. Adrian thanked several members of his security staff as they confirmed that the altered paperwork had been removed without creating panic among the guests. The evening would continue exactly as planned. Donations would still reach the families waiting for them. Scholarships would still change lives. Nobody outside a small circle would ever know how close everything had come to falling apart. "Why are you smiling?" I asked after noticing the faint expression on his face. He looked toward the ballroom before answering. "Because I spent years believing loyalty could be purchased through contracts, salaries, or influence." His eyes returned to mine. Tonight, the person who protected everything I built was the only one who expected nothing in return. I lowered my gaze, suddenly uncomfortable with the praise. "I only did what anyone should have done." Adrian quietly shook his head. If that were true, someone else would have spoken first. Those words were impossible to argue with. I remembered all the guests who had watched me become the evening's entertainment without saying a single word. The same people now complimented my dress, admired my confidence, and treated me like I had always belonged among them. Nothing about my character had changed, only the way they measured it had. Adrian seemed to understand exactly what I was thinking. "Emily," he said gently, "earlier tonight I did not ask for a designer, because I wanted to impress anyone." I looked up. "Then why?" His voice became quieter than the music surrounding us. "Because when I saw everyone laughing at your uniform, I realized they were trying to convince you that your value depended on fabric. I could replace the fabric in an hour. I wanted to remind them that your dignity had never needed replacing." My throat tightened, as emotion caught me completely by surprise. Nobody had ever defended me without expecting something in exchange. Nobody had ever separated my circumstances from my worth. For the first time in many years, I felt seen, not because I looked different, but because someone had finally understood the woman who had always existed beneath the uniform, and somehow that simple truth felt far more precious than every chandelier, diamond, and luxury surrounding us that night. The gala ended long after midnight, but somehow the mansion felt quieter than it had all evening. Guests drifted toward waiting cars beneath the glow of the front entrance, while the last notes from the string quartet faded into the cool night air. I stood alone beside the grand staircase, watching employees clear crystal glasses and fold linen tablecloths, as though the evening had been perfectly ordinary. My folded maid's uniform still rested inside the guest suite upstairs. The elegant gown still covered my shoulders. Yet I knew that when the sun came up, I would still wake before dawn, still worry about my grandmother's prescriptions, and still count every dollar before spending it. Expensive fabric could change an evening. It could not erase real life. "Emily." I turned to find Adrian walking toward me with the same calm expression he had carried from the moment he entered the ballroom. In his hand rested a small envelope. He stopped a respectful distance away before offering it to me. "What is it?" I asked. "A job offer." I looked at him without taking the envelope. "I already have one." A faint smile appeared. "Yes, you do." For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally, I accepted the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was not a contract, not a stack of legal documents, and certainly not a check. It contained only a single card, with the address of the Moretti Foundation, and one handwritten sentence. "If you ever decide your future deserves a different beginning, the door is open." I looked back up at him. "There is no salary listed, because I am not buying your loyalty." His answer came quietly. "If you come, it will be because you believe in the work, not because you feel obligated to me." I held the card in silence, and if I never call, he slipped both hands into his pockets. "Then I will wish you every success, exactly where life takes you." That answer surprised me more than anything else he had done that night. There was no pressure, no promise, no demand, only freedom. I slowly reached into the small garment bag Sophia had prepared for me and removed my neatly folded uniform. The patched sleeve rested exactly where I had left it. Adrian glanced at it before looking back at me. "You kept it." I nodded. "It reminds me where I came from." He smiled gently. "Then never let anyone convince you to be ashamed of it." I folded the uniform against my chest. "I think I finally understand something." "What is that?" I looked toward the ballroom, where strangers had first laughed at me and later congratulated me, as though I had become someone worthy overnight. "People treated me differently because my clothes changed," I said, "but I almost believed I had changed too." I shook my head slowly. "The truth is that I was always the same, Emily." Adrian nodded once. "Exactly." Outside, the first hints of dawn touched the horizon with pale blue light. The estate no longer felt like a place where I had been invisible. It felt like the place where I had remembered my own worth. I slipped the handwritten card into my purse without making any promises. Perhaps I would call one day. Perhaps I would not. For the first time in years, the decision belonged entirely to me. As I walked down the front steps toward the quiet street, I realized that the greatest gift I received that night had never been the beautiful gown, the elegant jewelry, or the attention of the most powerful man in the room. It was the simple reminder that dignity cannot be stitched into fabric, purchased with money, or measured by status. It begins the moment someone chooses to believe that their value was never missing in the first place, and sometimes the person who changes your life forever is simply the one who refuses to let you forget it.